Hello, and welcome back to the latest installment of the Chesapeake Requiem programming here at Suffolk Public Library. And today I am joined by Professor Christopher Loy. He is lecturer of anthropology at Christopher Newport University in Newport News. Dr. Loy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So today, you are here to speak to us about some research that you did on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay involving African Americans and the seafood industry. Tell me, what inspired you to look to this community?
Well, what inspired me to look at this community is because this community is, for all intents and purposes, invisible. Invisible to academic audiences, invisible to general audiences, invisible in terms of the overall image that we have of the Eastern Shore and seafood processing in general in the Chesapeake Bay, which, as you may be aware, is a central industry in this region and is very much, connected to some, core cultural ideas and images that sort of, revolve around all of the communities in the Chesapeake Bay. The aha moment for us was a bit of a discovery. I'd been doing ethnographic research up on the Eastern Shore for about 6 or 7 years. And my focus up to that point had really been on watermen who were overwhelmingly white and male, who work on the water and bring in the catch. And the seafood packing house owners who are overwhelmingly white and male and generally process the catch and then send it to distant markets. In all my time there, I hadn't seen a whole lot of African-American involvement, but the thing is, I'd never really been inside of the seafood processing houses. I had spoken to people, on the water, on the docks, and so on and so forth, in different kinds of contexts. And so I was in Saxis, Virginia, a few years ago, and all of a sudden, I was outside of a restaurant there, and behind the restaurant was this huge seafood processing area. These low, white cinder block, buildings, kind of sprawling over this whole area. And all of a sudden, I saw this giant barn door pulled back on rollers, right? One of those big, giant sliding barn doors. And inside this relatively dark area, there was a team of people working on sorting oysters, and almost to a person they were African American. And I'd never seen that side of the business before at all. And it surprised me. The thing that surprised me first off was just the kind of like the racial component here. All of these folks were African American, and never had I really seen in the town of Saxis or in Crisfield or some of the other places that I've gone, African Americans out and about in the town. For the most part, these areas, especially near the shore, are kind of coated white. And so I had my mind blown at that moment that, wow, there's a huge component of this that I simply don't understand. And isn't it a little strange that it seems to be so starkly raised? And so it was from that point on, I decided, I really got to look at this particular side. I sought to kind of understand the economic organization of the society on the Eastern Shore in terms of this racialized component, and reaching back in history and also interviewing people and talking to people. That's been the focus of my research for the last couple of years.
So you've been working on this project with African Americans in the seafood industry for several years now.
Yeah, for several years. As a college professor, you end up spending a lot of time, doing your job, right? Your day job, which is, basically being a university professor, being able to actually get out in the field and do proper field work. That only takes place during the summer. So usually you got to stack a couple of summers together before you really have enough qualitative data that you can base an analysis on. So yeah, I've been doing this for a couple of years.
And where in the Eastern Shore did you go?
Various places, Cape Charles, Saxis, Chincoteague, Crisfield. Those are some of the main sites that I've spent time at.
And who did you meet while you were there? Tell us about some of the people that you interacted with.
Um, depending on the day, it kind of depends on who you interact with in anthropology. But for the most part, we're talking to seafood processors. We're talking to the guys that drive the forklifts. We're talking to the people that sort the crabs and sort the oysters. We're talking to oyster shuckers. We're talking to crab pickers. We're talking to people that are involved in packaging this stuff up and sending it abroad. A fair number of occupational slots, definitely, but all within kind of like the packing industry itself.
So, what did you learn from interacting with these folks? What's their story?
What's their story? Well, the story's complicated. If you kind of take a macro sociological look at what's going on here, what you see are a certain occupational class that is closely tied to a particular race. And that's on both sides, the white side and the African American side. And so when you look at it that way, you start to get into the finer questions about those occupations. So on the one hand, you have watermen who sort of own their own boat, and they tend to have a crew that they pay. And even though while you talk to watermen, they'll tell you that there's not a whole lot of money in it, they're able to support their boat, they're able to support their families, and so on and so forth, fairly well. When you talk to crab pickers, for example, you're talking to a group of people who process crab meat, they turn the catch into commodity. And basically, this is a group of people that are employed in a flexible fashion. Right? When the season's going, then they have work. When the season sort of tails off, exactly. Seasonal work. The hours are pretty rough. A lot of times they have to be up before dawn, and they go in and they pick. In the case of crab pickers, they pick crabs all day. And there's an element of wage labor here. There's also an element of piecework here. So depending on the amount or the weight or the volume of crab meat that you pick, you get paid a certain amount. So from a macro sociological point of view, it's not difficult to read that as exploitation.
Oh yeah? How did this come to happen, that there's this racial line within the industry? What's the history of that?
It's an interesting history. It's a history that a lot of folks don't necessarily want to talk about. So in communities that have, a fairly large white population, fairly large African-American population, one of the things that you'll notice geographically is that they tend to be quite segregated. So when you take a look, at different census blocks and neighborhoods and things like that, they tend to be very racially homogenous. And so when you talk to people about it, oftentimes white folks will say, well, listen, we're all kind of poor here, right? My dad was a waterman, he never made much money. His dad was a waterman, never made much money. And, as a white family, there's no serious advantage here. And when you talk to African Americans there, you find the same sort of thing, but when they're talking about is that they've always been engaged in wage labor. So they've always been paid by the hour in an industry that is, like I said, say flexible, seasonal. Sometimes they have work, sometimes they don't have work. That said, I mean, in terms of sociology, in terms of economics, you see this disparity, and like I said, it's easy to read this as potentially exploitation, right? The interesting thing is when you talk to people, it's not oftentimes understood that way. So like I said, white folks tend to say, yeah, we're all kind of poor here, not that much of a difference between a white family and a black family. When you talk to black folks, they talk about the participation in the seafood industry, and a lot of the women that pick crabs during the summer really seem to enjoy it. That's where their friends are. Go there and they meet. There's a lot of funny banter and stuff like that over these big tables where they heap up the mounds of steamed crabs, and then they crack them open and they pick out the meat. And most of them do it almost automatically. I mean, it's a skill for sure. that you develop over time, and they can, they go through this and they're quite fast at it, and they're able to focus on other things. And one of the interesting things that I came across in my field work was the kind of singing that kind of, in certain places, that gets associated with this kind of work.
Work songs.
Work songs, oftentimes church songs, but certainly songs that you sing to sort of lift up the spirit, while you're doing this fairly repetitive work. One of the folks that I talked to, he's lived in the area for a long time. He was a kid in the 1950s, and he said that they used to love to get up in the early morning hours as their mothers would put on their crisp white uniforms that they would wear to the packing houses, and they would be kind of drinking coffee that they made in the thermos, and they would gather together in friend groups out in the street, and then they would start walking together to the packing house district. And he said, as a kid, it reminded him of a kind of a processional, is what he said, because somebody would start singing, then other folks would start singing, and there would be laughing and all of this kind of stuff. And he certainly has warm memories of it. And when you talk to the women that engage in seafood processing, they really seem to like it. They enjoy it. They don't look at it as, I'm getting paid wage labor here, and I'm not really able to save all that much back. They're looking at it as an opportunity to make some money and engage with friends and do these kinds of things. Anyway, it's an interesting situation, and it kind of blew away some of my preconceptions going into it.
So I also have a background in anthropology, and I remember learning the method of participant observation. And so I have to ask you, Dr. Loy, did you also pick some crabs? Did you get in there and shuck some oysters?
No, I've never picked any crabs. I've never shucked any oysters. I would be just a poor participant observer in doing that. I would get in the way and probably chop my hand off. I don't know if you've ever seen the knives that they use to shuck oysters. Pretty brutal.
Is that right?
Yeah, but no, I've never actually done it. It is, like I say, it's an embodied skill. So when you watch them, take the carapace apart, within the crab itself, I think there's 7 different kinds of meat that you can actually get out of a crab, and they instinctually know where to go. There are these spines that stick up within the crab itself that, a newbie like me would end up cutting his fingers on and then bleeding all over the crab meat, which would make it pretty much a waste. They know how to navigate all that, and they know how to do it practically without looking, right? So this automatic process, and they go through, and with their fingers they have to pull this out. And apparently there's no such thing as a machine out there that can do this as well and as efficiently as humans. So their jobs are certainly secured in this particular industry, should they want to keep them.
Did you notice any differences between the kind of work that women do and the kind of work that men do?
Yeah, there's a pretty sharp distinction. So within seafood processing itself, it tends to be African-American women who pick crabs, and it tends to be the African-American men who tend to work in either steaming the crabs or moving boxes of soft shell crabs, for example, from point A to point B. They get involved with loading, with trucking, and that end of the industry.
So part of what has inspired this series of programs at the library is climate change and sea level rise. And the Chesapeake Bay is a very dynamic natural environment. Did the kind of folks that you work with report any changes that they had seen in the Chesapeake Bay over time?
Yeah, everybody talks about the golden days. Talks about decades ago when oysters were plentiful, when the crabs came in and they were large and plentiful. When you talk to crab pickers today, they talk about the crabs as being relatively small, fairly puny, not a lot of meat. They have fond memories of the days when the crabs would come in really large, and you could actually get a lot of crab meat out of a single crab, which means you're actually making more per crab that you pick. So definitely
Oh,
scarcity. And they also refer to things like in Crisfield, for example, where there used to be, at least a dozen, if not more, packing houses just right down there by the harbor. Now there's really just a couple. And so there's been atrophy in the industry for sure. I think maybe there's been a bit of consolidation, but for the most part, the industry has shrunk. So when you take a look at oysters, for example, oysters kind of peaked in the 1880s. Um, and then it's kind of been a downhill slide since then. 1960s, we get diseases and things like that that decimate the oyster population even further. Um, so I think recent estimates that I've read put the oyster population at about 5% of peak.
wow.
Um, yeah,
So
yeah.
what are some of the reasons why crabs and oysters in the bay have changed?
Well, at least as far as the diseases that really decimated what was left of the oyster stock in the bay, a lot of that's attributed to overharvesting. This is where you cull the gene pool down so you don't have enough variety out there where useful mutations might actually take root in the population and spread that could be resistant to these diseases. So overexploitation is definitely one problem, right? We've just simply taken too many oysters out of the bay. The other thing has been warming waters. The Chesapeake Bay has been warming over the last several decades, and that makes a favorable environment for parasites and things
Hmm.
like that to proliferate. So these are the reasons that the oyster population has really plummeted. In terms of crabs, they largely point to things like overexploitation. We've just simply fished too many crabs out of the system, and they don't have enough time to recover.
So if the seafood industry is shrinking, among the folks that you worked with, is there kind of a generational shift? Fewer and fewer people are going into this line of work?
Yeah, there is. I think it has to do with shrinking opportunity. I think also it has to do with the fact that the women that pick crabs today had kids and they didn't want their kids to go into that industry. And you actually hear that a lot across the board in the seafood industry. The watermen are the same way. They say, I don't want my kid to work the water. I want him to get a job that has, insurance, right? Where there's actually some kind of income ladder that you could climb. The women that I've talked to say the same sort of things. That they got into the industry because their mothers brought them in and taught them, and their mothers got in because their grandmothers brought them in and taught them. And there's definitely this familial connection that reaches back generations. But these days, the women that pick crabs and process crabs tend to be quite a bit older. You do find some young people, but for the most part, it's an older generation, and they're proud to have put their kids in some cases through college, and now their kids are on professional tracks.
Um, any sense of solidarity among the workers? It sounds like it's, like you say, piecemeal seasonal work. So they're together for some part of the year and then apart for another part of the year. What ties that group together when they're not at work?
Oh, community, church. In a lot of these areas, it tends to be, like I said, fairly racially homogenous, geographically speaking. So a lot of these women, for example, they live in the same communities, right? So they live in the same part of town, in the same community. That's thing number one. Thing number two, church is a big influence there in terms of kind of maintaining community ties and things like that. Um, and of course, there's work, and they see each other. Every time the season rolls back around, they come back to work and they see each other. There's a fair amount of solidarity there. I don't see any evidence of union activity there like there was. Now, if you went back to 1938, it was a very, very different story.
They're right.
So, yeah, 1938, there was an incident in Crisfield, which at the time was this huge seafood location, one of the largest seafood producers in the world at the time. And what happened was one season in 1938, they decided to shift the price down for a gallon of crab meat. So I think they were getting 35 cents per gallon, and they shifted it down to 25 cents per gallon. And immediately there was a strike. And 600, mostly African-American women went on strike. And this was right before the crab season got started. So there was a lot of anxiety in the packing houses, a lot of anxiety amongst the watermen who supply the crabs to actually bring them in. There were instances of violence, instances of a white mob that they were trying to drive union influences out of the community. They were terrorizing African-American families who they thought were aiding and abetting the union folks, and so on and so forth. It was a really rough time. Ultimately, the crab pickers won out, but what they won was the ability just to keep the wage that it already was, right? So it didn't go down to a quarter, it remained at 35 cents a gallon. Anyway, so some attempt there at unionization early on, some striking there early on, but you don't hear much about that these days.
What about foodways? Did you learn about this community of people and the type of food that they eat? If they're picking crabs, you must have had some crab cakes while you were there.
Yeah, crab cakes are absolutely, they're very popular there. It depends on who you talk to. Some people you talk to, it's like, I work with this stuff all day long. I don't want to go home and eat it, right? Other people, crab's a delight, fish is a delight, oysters are a delight. So yeah, crab cakes, oyster fritters, things of that nature. Fish sandwiches.
I guess the Eastern Shore must have seen a lot of change, because in the not too recent past, it was a really out of the way place. And now the northern part of the bay is right by Baltimore, and Cape Charles is just 20 minutes to Norfolk, and a highway runs through it. So the Eastern Shore, not as remote as it used to be.
Not if you want to go there. There is there's a struggling tourist industry there. They're trying to draw people out to the Eastern Shore. It's still fairly secluded, I got to be honest. The industry has been dwindling in recent decades. So there's not the frequency of connections to outside places maybe that there used to be. If you take a look at it from a linguistic point of view, some of the dialects there are really interesting. For example, in Saxus, Saxus got its start, over 300 years ago, 350 years ago is when Saxus was first established as a location. I mean, this is right after, Jamestown. And in Saxus, there's a really strong accent. And you also hear it on Smith Island and Tangier and stuff like that. And some linguists have gone in there and found the accent to have antecedents in Elizabethan English and Cornwall and stuff like that. Anyway, all this speaks to the general seclusion of the Eastern Shore and a lot of these places. So, like I said, they're trying to get folks out there, but it's definitely not a destination hotspot yet.
So we are a public library, and many of our patrons are avid readers. Could you recommend a title for a general audience that they wanted to learn more about African Americans in the seafood industry?
Yeah, I have to say that there's not much out there, to be honest, on African Americans in the seafood industry. There have been, there's not much in the academic literature or in the popular literature. And this goes back to kind of my original sort of aha moment, seeing that barn door sort of drawn back. They're out of the public eye for the most part. And so, yeah, elsewhere, they've been described as an invisible population in these areas, because during the day, if they're at work, they're in these small cinder block units that don't have a lot of windows and so on. So they're basically invisible there. And then in terms of proximity to the water, where a tourist might want to go, they vacate the area after work and they go back to their neighborhoods, which are usually inland. So anyway, no, in short, there's not a lot out there for the popular reader to really get their hands on. but hopefully in time, because it's a very interesting aspect of the Eastern Shore. It's one that's understudied and underreported, and hopefully there'll be more recognition and appreciation of this particular population.
Well, Dr. Lloyd, should you write a book on the subject, maybe we could carry it at the library.
You'll be the first person I send a copy to there, Matthew.
Awesome. Thanks very much for taking some time to speak with us today. It's very interesting.
Thank you for having me.